How can we most effectively stem the tide of the coronavirus pandemic and reduce the likelihood and severity of knock-on effects? Welcome to Science Technology in the Future. The pandemic of coronavirus at the moment is severe and it's probably going to get worse. So we have Economist Robin Hanson here to discuss a neglected and perhaps controversial strategy of controlled infection. Understanding this idea may produce yuck responses. It's important to look at a variety of solutions with a clear head, including this one. It's also worth considering population-level strategies to defeat the coronavirus, as well as stopping nasty knock-on economic and societal effects that could be anywhere from mild to devastating. The chaos of total systems collapse may be far worse than the pandemic itself. But yes, do you want to just start off by giving us a brief introduction to what the virus, what the pandemic is, what the COVID-19 is?
Well, so one of the reasons I'm mildly reluctant to talk about this is because everybody's been talking about it, so I tend to want to talk about neglected things, so how could this be neglected still? And then also, this is not something I've become a professional in terms of getting a PhD or publishing in. And so even though a lot of my work over the years has been contributing in the areas that weren't my main focus, I still pause each time and take, be slightly reluctant. So I'm trying to be careful here not to overstep what I know, but still to be able to say things a lot of us know. So we are now facing this very difficult pandemic, and every 5 years or so, some new disease shows up in the world, but they vary in terms of their parameters. And every once in a while, it's really bad set of parameters. So, the worst one in a very long time was the 1918 pandemic. And what was bad about it was that it spread very easily and killed a large percentage of the people who got it. And then another thing that can be bad, perhaps it was bad about that one, is having symptoms, being able to infect people before you have symptoms. Because that makes it very hard to know who. If you wait till you see symptoms and then you isolate those people, you've missed all the people they've infected while they were not having symptoms. So a bad disease is one that spreads very easily, including when there are no symptoms, and kills a large fraction of people. And we've got one of those, and so that's what's happening in the world right now. Now. When you have one of these diseases, there's a number of things you can hope for. One is that you catch it really early and you just close it off. It can't really move from person to person unless those people are near each other. So as soon as you find one of these diseases and you find that it's new, if you put a lot of work into figuring out exactly where they got it and tracing all the people around them and checking for symptoms, then you can sometimes just lock it off, even if it's a pretty bad thing. And there was a chance that that could have happened in China, and we don't know how much the chance was, but apparently they screwed up by repressing the information of the initial disease and punishing the doctors who were trying to talk about it. And then by the time they changed their mind, it was all over at least Wuhan in China. Then, of course, they did do that same sort of effort at a much larger scale. And with respect to China, actually succeeded in at least temporarily shutting down the growth. But on that much larger scale, people traveling from Wuhan to the rest of the world have started, centers of the infection all over the world. And some of those centers are really bad, such as South Korea had a lot of infections, but they seem to, like China, be willing to really shut it down, and at least at the moment seem to have cut down the growth. But Iran and Italy have not, and that's going wild there. And the problem is, if you catch it early, you can shut it down by tracking all of it and really just blocking it from moving. But once it's in a large fraction of a large population, it's just really hard to see how it doesn't go everywhere. That is, even China and South Korea, even if they're succeeding now, if this thing spreads across the world and infects half the world, say, it'll just be really hard for those countries to keep a strong enough border to keep it from coming back in and infecting most of those places too. So we're really at this pretty sad situation here, where it looks like it's in enough places at enough high enough level that just won't be possible to keep it from spreading everywhere. And by spreading everywhere, we mean like or over a quarter, a third, a half of the population having been exposed to it and initially going through the illness. And as you know, it's hard to estimate the actual level of damage of it because it varies by context. And the key context that varies is how much you've overwhelmed the medical system. So it seems like that for this one, in places where you haven't overwhelmed the medical system, like South Korea or that cruise ship, or some places outside of China, in China outside of Wuhan, it seems like the death rate is about 0.5%. Concentrated among the elderly or older people my age, so I'm much more concerned.
Yeah, right. I thought it was 70 on.
So if 0.5% infects half the world, then you're talking 0.25% of the world, and that's 20 million people or 2 million people, right? That's a lot of people. There's 8 billion in the world. So 1% would be
a lot of people.
1% would be 20 million, I guess, and so 0.25% would be
10. Oh no, 0.25% would be like 5 million.
Or but I think that 0.5% is the typical thing for it. So then you're looking at about 10 million people. That's if everybody gets good medical care. But the problem is, this thing doubles. Like initially, it was doubling every week. Lately, it was doubling every 4 days. Who knows if that's a combination of the statistic thing. But this thing doubles really fast. So if it's doubling that fast as it reaches its peak, i.e., infecting most everyone, then you've got half the world being infected, or a quarter of the world be infecting within 1 week period. And so, which is very concentrated in time. And the problem is, like, 10% of the people need ICU care, and a substantial fraction of those need what's called a ventilator, or some, technology to help them breathe. There's a limited number of those. So in Italy already at the moment, even though there's only a few thousand cases, they're already at the point where they have to let people die because they don't have enough ventilators. And they have a rule that, like, people over 60 or 65, you just don't help them at all because don't have enough. So like people like me go, wow. And that's early on. I mean, they're still far from infecting half of Italy.
Right. Yeah,
and so, it's going to get a lot worse there. And so if that's how it happens most of the world, now you've got a much higher death rate. So in Wuhan, the death rate was maybe 3%. And that's where they only had 80,000 cases out of 11 million people. That's not where they had 5 million people sick out of 11 million people. So you can see this death rate could go way higher.
And so the idea is to try and flatten the disease.
Right. So the things we could have done initially was to block it off and just not have it spread. We failed at that. It looks like that's just a permanent failure. We could do a Hail Mary with a vaccine, but all the experts say, vaccines take a long time, and there's just no easy way to avoid testing them, and a lot of the tests fail. So we just have to make them, several years, way faster than this thing. So this thing looks like, if it doubles every week even, then in 10 weeks it goes by a factor of 1,000. In 20 weeks, that's a factor of 1,000,000. And, that's enough to do the whole world. So, and 20 weeks is less than half a year. So, you just don't have a year or two to wait for a vaccine. Sorry. Eventually a vaccine will be good. Now, if this thing spreads through most of the world and then half the world gets infected, then we could have what's called herd immunity, where enough of us are well that it can't spread very easily, and then it stops spreading as much. But still, a lot of people would get sick every year, just like today with colds, and it can mutate a bit. And if it mutates, that means the immunity isn't as good because you're not immune against the new version, and so this could just keep coming back and hurting us a lot until we got a vaccine or some treatment. So you still want that vaccine or treatment eventually. Okay, so if not a vaccine, and if you don't stop it early, there's only one other thing you can do, which is to spread out over time who gets infected when. That's all that's left.
Controlled infection.
Instead of having a quarter of the world get sick in the same week, try to move it out over months and months. And so that's what I was focused on thinking about. How could you spread it out? And there's a lot of interesting ways we could do that, and that I haven't seen in the literature. I didn't look that thoroughly, but it seems like the literature hasn't really explored a lot of these possibilities of how you could potentially spread it out over time. So obviously one way is different places get infected at different times, and then you say move medical personnel around or equipment around. So for example, apparently China doesn't need their ventilators so much anymore, and they've sent a lot of ventilators to Italy, where they've got the big problem at the moment, right? That's good. Or of course, you could just try to ramp up production of these ventilators, like make lots more of them really fast. That would also help. We don't hear much about that. Maybe it's happening, but you'd like them to be talking about it. They're just going wild making these things, please, because we need them. You might also, of course, want them to make more personnel, like train more people. Now, in part, they're doing that by basically closing down the rest of the hospital and turning everybody in all areas into doing this. That's what's happening in Italy. So you have a heart attack, you have a stroke. Sorry, they're not doing that now. They're just doing parameters. Coronavirus. That's an expensive way to produce new capacity. So you might wish that people were out there like just taking other people and training them fast just to do this thing, but you don't hear much about that. What else can we do? Flatten the curve. Slowing the infection rate does flatten this curve. So if people isolate, if they don't go to meetings, if they don't travel, if people wear masks and gloves and all of that stuff, that reduces the rate at which people get infected. It doesn't prevent eventually most people getting infected, but it spreads it out over time, and that's very helpful. And that's the main advice everybody's giving right now, because that's the main thing to do right now. Other than working on the vaccine, it's too late to isolate it. Spread it out over time, which is a good idea, of course.
Right.
But it's not the only thing we could do. And so I was noticing in a simple analysis that there are other things one could do in addition to just having everybody spread out. So obviously one of the problems with isolating everybody is you shut down the economy. And now,
what are the knock-on effects?
who's going to make stuff? So, we have some stocks for a while, so you can shut it down for a while, just like in China and Wuhan. They shut down Wuhan entirely for a while, but then they kind of had to turn it back on, and we're still haven't quite seen whether the problem reasserts itself once people start going to work and start doing things. And so, you kind of have to let people at least associate with each other enough to go to their jobs and do all the stuff that needs to get done.
Yes. I mean, you wrote quite extensively about what could happen. I mean, if people don't, if special infrastructure positions or key medical personnel don't go to work for an extended period of time, then we could be facing down the barrel of a system's collapse, right?
Right, so there's different kind of systems. You definitely want people to go to work just to make the water running and the sewers and the electricity and the internet. And we probably will have that at least for a while. I mean, you'd need and thankfully that's a lot automated. And, you just need those people to go to work. And you definitely, if those people might run out, you want to train more replacements because you just need all that stuff to run. I'm somewhat hopeful at least that can keep going. But, if you need people to be making food and distributing it, and those are other jobs you need. Will Amazon come to the door? Who will come to the door? Do you have to go to the store? Are people out there running the factories making stuff? So some stuff we can wait on, maybe bicycles and cars. We just don't have to make it at the moment. We can keep using the old bicycles and cars for a few months or even a few years. Just like in a war economy, you often just turn off a lot of making of stuff that you can wait on, like refrigerators, say. If you just stopped making refrigerators for 2 years, we would mostly be okay because our refrigerators last more than 2 years, mostly. So, we can just wait on a lot of things, but still, it's a limited time period. So, you just can't do this indefinitely. So what else can we do? We can slow down by isolating people and shutting them in and not letting them contact. How else can we flatten the curve? Well, one way is to change the variance in who is easily infected. So, I mean, as we said, you could have the variety across geographic areas, as you said, like different places get sick at different times, and then you move resources around.
Yep.
That would be one way, and we're kind of doing that accidentally, of course. But whether we'll be willing to move the resources around remains to be seen. I mean, maybe everybody just wants to hold on to the resources, waiting for their problem, and then they're not sharing so much. But any way in which in some area people vary in their likeliness of getting infected is actually good. This is a case where inequality is good. So, you know, everybody has the knee-jerk response, inequality bad, boo inequality, let's get rid of inequality. But here, inequality is good because, you know, if some subpopulation is infected more easily, then they get infected first. The other population infected less easily, they get infected later. You're moving it in time, you're spreading it out. And that's also good. As well as reducing the average rate of infection, it's good to increase the variance. So, you know, having cities and rural areas is a natural way in which some people are more vulnerable because they're in dense areas, and then other places are more isolated. I don't know what necessarily we could do to increase that in the short run, but at least it's not a terrible thing to have it be there, this variety. And then, you know, the last obvious thing is, well, if you want to spread it out over time, and it's really hard to delay for some people, well, why not speed it up for some other people? Why not make them get infected faster? Now, if you think that through, just doing that doesn't help. That is, if you imagine taking somebody who was otherwise not going to be infected soon and making them infected now, and doing nothing else in terms of their likelihood of infecting anybody else, then you just moved the whole curve forward in time. You just accelerated the whole process. And so the problem is, right at the time you accelerated, you've increased the average infection rate at that time, and that's not spreading it out, that's concentrating it. That's bad. But it might be good for you, and I've heard a lot of people like say this is what I'm saying when it's not. It might be good for you if you're going to get infected anyway, or there's a pretty good chance to get infected early and then get that 0.5% mortality rate instead of the 3% or 10% mortality rate that might happen later. You know, if you have a 50% chance of getting infected later and you take a for sure chance now, all you need is a factor of 2 difference in the now versus later mortality rate to make that look like it might be a good deal. And yes, it might be a good deal. And in fact, you know, I can't argue against that, but socially it's not a good deal. It's not helping everybody else, it's just helping yourself. But if you choose to get infected yourself and simultaneously quarantine and isolate yourself, if you can create a correlation between getting infected and then isolating, now we have a way you can have a social benefit. I mean, the problem, if you just infect yourself and then you infect other people at the same rate that anybody who is accidentally infected would infect other people, you're just speeding up the process. But we have quarantine resources, i.e. isolation resources, and we can have some people be more isolated than others. And the question is, who should we have be the most isolated? And obviously someone who is deliberately infected would be an ideal person to have be the most isolated.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to trust human behavior. Like, it'd have to be a pretty controlled thing.
Right, so the proposal would be, let's make a place where you can choose to go, and if you go there, maybe we'll pay you to go there, you're a volunteer, and we will infect you there, but we will keep you there, and then you will be isolated there, and then we will keep you there until you are recovered or dead, and we will pay for all of that. We will pay for the testing and the medical treatment, and we've got you covered. You come to this place, and we're just going to manage the process. And we've made it legal, and it's approved, and so you know that, like, this is just a thing. Like, we don't want people to go infecting themselves and trying to isolate themselves. I mean, you know, come on. But if it was open and organized, then a lot of people who are now saying today, gee, maybe I'd rather be infected now than later, those could be the volunteers, especially if we pay them for it. And then that could spread it out. So I'm not just speculating this. I have actually set up some simulations, some concrete calculations that directly say that in some plausible parameter space that it does actually help. It does, you know, cuts the mortality by 20%, say. 20% fewer people die if you try to infect a lot of people early on. Now, it does move the whole time scale forward, and you can see in my blog posts about that. So if you were hoping for a vaccine, Hail Mary pass soon, well then you're kind of giving up on that hope with the deliberate infection because it happens faster. But still, you save lives. And you don't have to, it doesn't compete with the other things you might be doing, at least in terms of trying to spread out the curve. I mean, you could be trying to isolate everybody and flatten the curve that way, and also deliberately infecting some people who very carefully isolate. You can still be working on a vaccine. You can still be trying to, spread out the resources. And the people who should go first in this deliberate infection, one obvious candidate is medical and critical resource workers.
Yeah.
Who you don't want to be sick at this peak when quarter of everybody gets sick in a week. You could get them sick early. Some of them die, but most of them recover. And now they're ready and available to help later. And of course, if there's substantial infection, now they can be, less bundled up with with everything, say, working in a hospital. They don't have to have the goggles and everything on. If they've already been infected, they're already recovered, and they can...
And their immune system is already adapted.
Yeah. Right. At least for the duration of whatever immunity there is. I mean, many things don't have infinite duration. Sometimes it's just a few months, but that could still be enough. Now, some people asked me the question a few days ago, and I realized I didn't know, and so I've been trying to do a calculation, but I haven't quite finished it yet because I got distracted today. Would it be better to send young or old people into early infection? So you can see there's two different arguments for it. One would be, well, we can infect a lot of young people, and then there'd be this herd immunity where fewer people were available for infection. Because, of course, one of the ways that old people get sick is that they get it from a young person. So the more young people who are no longer infectious, then the better for the old people. On the other hand, the old people suffer the most when they get it at the peak. So maybe since they have this much higher death rate, maybe it would be better to have them get infected early so that they can avoid that much higher death rate. My guess is that second effect is the one that'll win, but I still need to do a concrete calculation to find out.
Well, that's fascinating. Have you done any sort of consideration on the degree of the initial viral load to infect people with in this controlled infection?
I certainly, I've abstracted away from that, but it certainly, if, as some people have speculated, that you have a worse situation when you just get a bigger infection all at once initially, then you'd like to give them a small one and plausibly give their body longer time to adjust. That makes sense, but I don't know of any concrete data that shows that. But that would certainly make sense. I mean, as long as you're infecting somebody, you might as well give them the smallest thing you can and give their body the longest time to adapt to it.
Well, that's how, I mean, we know that's how vaccines sort of operate. If you give them a dead viral strain and the nervous system recognizes it and adapts, we give them a low dose or something like that. But this is obviously not a vaccine. We don't want to claim it's a vaccine.
Right.
But it is like I guess you can say in some cases, in some ways it's a similar strategy. Yeah.
Well, of course, if you're deliberately infecting it, now you can study the process and search in the space of ways to do it to find the ways that work best. In ways that you can't do, of course, when you're just looking in the field and seeing what happens, because it's all mixed up with what's going on in the world. So, deliberate infection would also have the nice side effect of giving you cleaner data about the infection rate and the progress of the disease and that sort of thing, because you could pick the people and see what happens.
Right.
But of course, presumably we'll see some of that in these vaccine trials that are coming out. So many people have objected to this whole thing on sort of emotional, moral, ethical, sort of grounds.
Yuck factor grounds.
Right, a sort of yuck factor. Because basically, yes, of course, there is this risk that if you get infected early, you will die. And therefore, we cause somebody. So people have made the analogy to a trolley problem here. But of course, all through history and society, we have asked people to take risks. And it might be good. Bad. If you're a logger, the tree might fall on you. If you're a fisher, the boat might sink. If you're a warrior, you might get killed in battle. We've often asked people to take on risks, and people have taken on risk, and we compensate them to some degree. And if you think they're not compensated enough, well, let's pay them more. But even in the context of this particular disease, I know that United Kingdom, at least, and I think elsewhere, they ask for volunteers to be deliberately infected in order to test vaccines out, and they pay them, £4,000 or something, or euros, I guess, to be infected, and that's already a precedent showing that, at least in some context, we're okay with paying people to take on a risk. And here, of course, it might be a squeamish sort of thing that, in fact, they are personally benefited by going early and getting better medical coverage than people would get by going later.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that would set the limit about when you stop deliberately infecting people. As the medical system gets overwhelmed with deliberate, then you're overwhelming it even more with these deliberate infections, and then you'd stop.
Right.
And you can calculate sort of in any one situation. A model, at least, you could calculate the trade-off there, but you might get it wrong in the real world. So, I mean, you know, I have to admit that it doesn't look likely that anybody will adopt this policy during this pandemic episode, although we still have time, I suppose.
You'd have to have it very soon,
it.
right? Yeah.
Right, but, you know, I was inspired to look at this by the fact that, you know, I noticed that I said, oh my God, we've got this problem. This thing's growing really fast. It's nothing seems ready to stop it, and no vaccine's coming soon, and what the hell can we do? And I did this analysis, and then I got this reaction of people saying that's a terrible idea. But honestly, that in some sense makes me think I might be onto something, because otherwise I have to go, well, why don't all these epidemiologists already talk about this? Why wouldn't that just be a standard thing? Why would I be the only one to find this sort of thing? And I guess I don't guess that I'm the first person to figure this out. I'm pretty sure somebody else must have. But I could guess that the community is averse to this. It just looks bad. It feels bad. And therefore, they have decided that they don't want to risk their professional reputation or public respect or legitimacy by talking about it.
Well, it could look a lot better if things get worse, and we need to take even harsher quarantining and even culling types of operations.
So I've actually spent a lot of my life thinking about sort of radical proposals for doing things differently. And there's a problem about when to make a proposal, when to make a radical proposal. So if you have an ordinary time and you make some radical proposal and there isn't a crisis or anything, then mostly people go, the world's okay, world's fine. You know, you want me to take a big chance, but, you know, big chances can go wrong. Why should we change to something that's different that we don't know as well? We should, you know, stick with what we have as long as things are going okay. So it's actually pretty hard to get people who are, you know, peaceful and prosperous and comfortable to consider making big radical changes. Okay, if I say, fine, but every once in a while there'll be a crisis. How about then? How about in a crisis, if I could go suggest it then? Well, unfortunately, in a crisis, people are going, oh my God, we got to do something now. And now they want something that's like pretty well proven to work. And they're feeling actually kind of risk averse in a crisis. And they're, you know, it's hard to get people to consider doing a radical thing in a crisis unless they're kind of really desperate and they got, what else we got, you know? So there's a lot of TV shows out there, a lot of movies that have the theme of some characters and they get in a problem situation, and then some character says, I've got an idea, and everybody else goes, well, that sounds stupid, but what else we got? Let's do it. And of course it works, and everybody's happy in the end. And so
plot devices.
If you're desperate enough, you might say, well, let's try most anything. But of course, people are almost never that desperate. And so they're just really risk averse. If things are going bad, they aren't that eager to try something new. Well, now you've got a problem. When do you ever make a radical proposal? When they're rich, when they're peaceful and prosperous and comfortable, or when they're in desperate, in need? Neither time looks good. Is there any time? Well, there might be a time right after the problem. Right after you had a big crisis, and then you did some stuff and then it worked so well. And now things are a little more peaceful and prosperous, but you really remember that crappy thing that happened. And now you might be more interested in listening to a radical proposal. Because now you might think, let's not let that happen again.
Well,
so
there's
you're more comfortable with taking a risk and trying something new because the crisis isn't there anymore, but you remember that you need something for that sort of crisis.
When was the last massive pandemic? Was it 1918?
Certainly at this sort of scale. I mean, we have had bigger pandemics over the years.
Yes, of course.
Like 1957 or something.
Right.
But they didn't, you know, threaten as many people as this seems to threaten. So, and unfortunately, 1918
so we don't really have much in living memory then. Even the people who are over 100 wouldn't have remembered.
Well, but 1918 got overwhelmed by the war. So unfortunately, what happened is that, like in the United States and all the other countries that were involved in the war, they repressed news of the pandemic and they, discouraged and even punished people for talking about it, and avoided. They didn't do the things that could have reduced it, like President Wilson in the United States was warned by his personal physician and military physicians that, hey, if you put all these troops in these carriers across and send them across the boat, they'll infect each other in the boat on the way there, which is what happened. But he said, war effort's more important, I'm just going to do it. And nobody talked about this. And then after the war, people were so focused on the war itself and learning from the war that the pandemic, unfortunately, didn't get as much attention, even though it killed a lot more people. Like in the United States, more people died from the pandemic in 1918 than have died in all the wars, in World War I and since. So in some sense, we really have this, it should be this really potent story that we all remember, but it isn't, because it's a sort of a side show to World War I. So emotionally, we're just much more engaged by war than we are by pandemic. So at the moment, we don't have a war going on. That makes me more hope we will be willing to learn a lesson from this. If after this, 10 million people die worldwide, 250,000 or more die in the United States, people might well be ready to point fingers. And of course, the Democrats and Republicans will point at each other and say, you didn't do the right thing.
Politicizing, yeah.
Right, and at the moment, like the sort of things they are doing, you go, like they want to reduce payroll taxes and give subsidies to oil companies and hotels. Like, that's your solution? And, they are ripe for criticism later. And of course, the CDC did a really crappy job. And then people will be asking, is that to be blamed on Trump or the previous administration? Or who should we blame for how badly they screwed it up in terms of setting up testing and things? But at least people may be willing to listen to proposals for how to do better in the future soon after everything went really bad. That would be my hope, is that. And then having made this proposal before things got bad, it might be more legitimacy in terms of like being the Monday morning quarterback who suggests a solution after things went badly. I think there is more legitimacy in suggesting a solution before things go badly and say, I told you so, you could have done this.
Right. Well, it seems though like there's a lot of solutions maybe out there. I imagine there's a lot of other ones that I haven't heard of and that you haven't heard of. But look, we can't know exactly what the future will look like. So it seems, on at least prima facie, that we should consider a variety of solutions and try and diversify our risk portfolios. But what about which solutions are going to be compatible with each other is also critical now.
Sure. So early on when I suggested this, people said, well, shouldn't we wait for a vaccine? Should we hope for a vaccine? Obviously deliberately infecting more people early on is kind of deciding the vaccine is not going to come in time and deciding to do something else, right? Other people often also said, well, if we aren't sure how long the immunity is here, then if we deliberately infect people and the immunity is really a short time, then that might end up being regrettable. But of course, usually the immunity is much longer, but in any one case it could be different. So there is this, set of gambles you have to make initially based on some estimates of the parameters. One interesting, related fact here is that many people, including myself, looked at the initial parameters and said, this is obvious, this is going everywhere, we're in trouble. And a lot of other people said, yeah, who knows? You can't trust that sort of analysis, let's wait and see. And, that's an interesting debate in some sense between analysts who look at concrete models and predict numbers and other people who say, you analysts often get it wrong, you can't be relied on that well, we should just wait and see what happens. And of course, doing something like deliberate infection, it requires that you make a decision about what might happen if you wait and see and say that that doesn't look so good. Let's do something other than wait and see.
Deliberate and controlled infection, yeah.
Right. So my colleague Tyler Cowan had a blog post where he talked about sort of analysts versus base raters, people who just say, well, most pandemics aren't a big problem. Well, why should we assume this one will be? And people who say, yes, but if you look at these numbers, this looks bad. And they say, well, you aren't so sure of those numbers. Those numbers could be wrong. And let's just, not get overboard and panicky and wait and see. And so that's like a fundamental debate in the world that I'm often involved in because I tend to be the analyst in many areas.
So a lot of people want to avoid panic now because they want to avoid the sort of desperate behaviour that people might engage in if they're
Well, they
if they're
say
panicking.
that, but I'm not sure they mean it. There's this slogan, "Don't panic," that everybody nods and says that's a good slogan, but I'm not sure people really know what they mean by it. That is, I'm not sure what people have anything particular in mind by what would panic look like exact. They could say, well, buying too much toilet paper, and you might go, that's the problem? People might buy too much toilet paper, and you go, among all the things that could go wrong, that's really not very high on my list of concerns here, that people will buy too much toilet paper. What else you got? I mean, you think people are going to go, now if there was, in some olden days, there might be an ethnic difference. Oh my God, the Chinese are infecting us. Let's go kill all the Chinese or something. We're not in a world where that's at all plausible thing people do. And of course, by now, Chinese has little to do with it because it's already spread much farther. But, I think people just have this "don't panic" as a slogan. And then in their mind, panic just means doing wrong. Whatever you do that's the wrong response, that must have been panic if you did something. But unfortunately, the association of "don't panic" tends to make people say, well, let's do less. I don't want to look like I'm panicking. Let's not do much. Which is kind of bad when you have a big problem that something needs to be done about.
Are we at the stage where we need to start thinking about if things really do go pear-shaped with this virus and we do get some shortages in supply chains and there's a sort of mild to medium collapse? What can we do to sort of
this
recover?
is entirely a choice, of course. I mean, obviously, in the worst case, we have, we just let the economy keep humming and ignore the virus, and in the worst case, 10% of the population dies, or 5%, and, we all continue on, right? The world doesn't come to an end. Now we say, well, we don't want that many people dying. Let's, shut down the economy and isolate stuff. Well, now we have a different problem we're causing. So there's a trade-off here between two problem scenarios. Way too many people dying because everybody gets sick at once, or the economy being hindered and our lives being hindered by people not being able to work and get stuff. So it seems like, we should be making a trade-off between those bad things. Let's suffer as much as we can stand to suffer for as long as we can in terms of shutting down the economy and social interactions so that we can spread this thing out, but not at the expense of killing ourselves that way. I mean, if so many people, if we didn't have enough people to go to work to keep the lights on or the sewers working or that sort of thing, well, that would clearly be too much isolation. We definitely need the system to keep functioning, and that's a choice we can make. We can just make sure enough people do those things. And of course, if there are people who would be taking a personal risk by making sure the lights stay on, then we should be compensating them through money and glory. I mean, in many societies in the past, when there was a crisis and some people sacrificed themselves or their families to help in the crisis, we celebrate that, rightly so. And we should offer that celebration and glory to people who will be willing to do that sort of thing.
That's true, right. So, I mean, when the lights go out and people get desperate and do silly things, are they going to go around to their neighbours and eat them, or are they going to go around to their neighbours and help them out? Do you think we're heading for more of a world which looks like McCarthy, what's his name? McCarthy's The Road?
Well, yeah, so The Road is really extreme, a crazy extreme, where people are mainly just eating each other as a way to survive, which doesn't work really well. So the scenario has to be, you're locked in your room and you're afraid of dying, and so your neighbor has something that you want that will keep you alive. Now, if we allowed the food system to break, and so people were starving and some people had stocked up more food and the other people wouldn't, then you might well see people breaking in to steal food. But clearly we should not let it get that far. Now, of course, if you're eating rice and beans and you're tired of it and your neighbor has steak and oranges or something and you're really envious of better food, you might have some temptation to go steal the better food, but that's going to be weaker. I would think, the bigger issues would be, presumably what we're seeing in Italy at the moment, people who need ICU care or they will die, go to the hospital and they say, sorry, no room. You're too old, you have a heart condition, you have a stroke, you are not qualified, you must stay outside and die. people could get really mad in that situation. Now, of course, they're too sick to do anything. Their friends and relatives might get mad. But, of course, that would be a reason to make sure there is sufficient security around hospitals. And, of course, almost no doubt most societies will anticipate the need for sufficient security around hospitals. I mean, I've seen the videos of hospitals in Wuhan and how hard it was for some guy to try to get there because they were locked down and protected. But, of course, if there's any perception of favoritism, that could produce resentment. And, you can imagine some sort of revolt or revolution if people believe that their kind of people are just not getting help and other people are getting favorite treatment, right? If all my relatives and friends don't get to go to the hospital, but somehow all those people's can, well, that could be the source of pretty strong resentments and urge to do big things to deal with it. So, we shouldn't do that. Certainly create the impression of more uniform criteria about who's going to get help if you're going to do that.
Where are we going to get all the money to do this?
Well, I mean, we will only do as much as we have resources to do, and then we won't do more. Of course, that's the problem with the hospitals. If we had built more hospitals and trained more doctors and built more ventilators, then more people would live. But in the short run, we can't make more, even though we have lots of factories that aren't going to be used because we just didn't convert them. So, the Economist says you will only use the resources you have, and that will run out. So if we all just isolate at home and don't go to work, and then factories sit idle and trucks sit idle, and then eventually the grocery stores run out of stuff. And then you gotta turn it back on, or people start to starve, right? You don't have pharmaceuticals being produced, and they don't get delivered, and people have medical problems because they don't have the pharmaceuticals they need, right? I mean, those are very basic key trade-offs. But I expect we just won't go so far in the direction of a shutdown as to have those issues. I mean, honestly, more likely our problem is we don't go far enough. So, in China, they showed just how far they could go, and they showed an impressive capacity that most of the rest of the world doesn't really have of being able to set down rules and enforce them and have them be
quickly,
allowed. Basically, yeah. So now, of course, it would have been more impressive had they prevented the whole infection in the first place. They had an unimpressive initial reaction, and then they had a very impressive second reaction.
So do you think we're all past the face-saving mode at the moment? It's just China's recognized that they've sort of made some errors early on and suppressed the information from getting out and things like that. Do you think they're past it?
Well, I mean, the main thing is they're going to still look pretty good compared to the rest of the world. At the moment, there are these two phases. They screwed up in the first case, and then they did pretty well in the second case. But that's not the end of the story. After the end of the story is most of the rest of the world will just be a basket case, be a terrible situation like in Italy. Millions of people will die. And most of the rest of the world will look like if only they had the self-control that China had to set things down. And then, of course, the last phase of the story will be that China succumbs to all the infections that come back through the border. China, at the moment, can manage to keep the infection down because most of the rest of the world isn't infected, right? And they were the source of it. But once most of the rest of the world is infected, and they try to interact with the rest of the world by trading, etc., it will just come back across the border and they will suffer it all. So they really only put it off, giving themselves more time to prepare. But it will come back even for China. And that's the key logic is once enough millions of people out there have this thing in a world where people travel, etc., around, how do you stop it?
Yeah, well, it sounds like a very difficult problem, if possible at all. But you can sort of mitigate the effect, and you're suggesting the controlled infection. Do you think would you suggest people try and infect themselves if they could? At least in a mild way. I think it's...
I would say, please only do that if you are set up to then isolate yourself sufficiently long and to get the care you need if you need it, right? I mean, the whole point is, if you just infect yourself without being more isolated than a random infected person would be, who was accidentally infected, you're not helping the whole situation, you're hurting it. Maybe you're helping yourself, but at the rest of our expense. So I can see why you might be tempted, but I can't approve. But it wouldn't take that much effort for you to isolate yourself. I mean, obviously, since you're intentionally infecting yourself, please don't go to work, don't go to a party, don't go to a concert. For God's sake, you know, you did this very solemn, serious thing. You expect to get sick soon. Yes, please isolate yourself and be ready for that, and have whatever medical resources you may need available to deal with that. And of course, you know, you don't even know for sure what sort of permissions you need. Like, is this a pre-existing condition for your health insurance, or, you know, are you going to be accused of murder for your neighbor if they catch it from you? I mean, because you infected yourself. I mean, I would rather there just be, it was a more accepted thing that was approved and you know, arranged by some organization that had approval, but I can't disapprove of you infecting yourself if you in fact make sure you are isolated enough to and you do it early enough. Again, there's a point in this process where it's too late, the system is overwhelmed, and you're infecting yourself doesn't help at that point. At that point, you should just isolate and hope to get past the peak. But since we're now well before the peak, you can have a reasonable hope of getting infected before the peak.
I guess there's a bit conversations that were going cross-purpose to each other I've seen around this. Some at what should a good citizen do in order to reduce the likelihood of population level problems, and then there's what can you do to increase the survival of yourself and your loved ones, or you and your family. How do you... So
I find it interesting that if we think about those two categories of topics, if you look at most Twitter conversation or most op-eds in the paper or most sort of smart dinner conversation, people are almost entirely talking about what should we do together to deal with policies. And then we get to this thing, and all of a sudden most conversations switch to what should I do? And I think it's a striking evidence that we're more selfish when the stakes get high. We're certainly quite willing to be pro-social and helpful for the world as long as we're not at great risk. But as soon as we feel that we're at risk, we go like, no, what should I be doing? And so, you know, actually I found it hard to get anybody to talk about this deliberate infection, deliberate exposure sort of concept, because people are so obsessed with what should I do? And when that aligns, so of course, you know, most of the discussion about what should we do has been when it aligns with what you should do for yourself. That is, if you don't want to get infected, you should isolate. What helps all of us? Yes, you getting isolated, two together. And so now you can do both. You can tell them what's good for them and what's good for us because they're the same thing. But if what's good for them is different than what's good for us, now, you know, people are less interested in talking about that. Although they might be interested in shaming people. So, like, for example, if you go ahead with your meeting, even though the rest of us think your meeting shouldn't happen, maybe we like to jump on you and say nasty things about you and tisk and be morally self-righteous about how bad you are. So people are into that, as long as it's relatively clear, like the thing we all think you should be doing. But like thinking outside the box and coming up with new policies that might help, that doesn't help you be morally self-righteous. People are not so eager into that.
Well, you've written a book called Elephant in the Brain.
Yes, indeed.
Sort of goes into this sort of idea too. So yeah, I don't remember whether you actually covered pandemics as a case study, but
no,
it could
definitely not. I did not.
Yeah.
Well, we had a chapter on medicine, of course, which raises the larger question of when is pandemic medicine useful? Or when do people get into the mode where they focus on what's actually useful versus what's symbolic? So, I mean, it really is amazing just how badly our official government organization responsible for dealing with pandemics screwed this up in terms of testing. I mean, that means, you know, so lots of other places in the world just do a lot more tests than the United States, because the United States, the CDC said only we're allowed to approve the test, and then they approved a test that, oops, they screwed up, it didn't work. And so then they said, wait for the new test, and now they're saying, okay, we've got new tests, but ooh, this material's running out, maybe we can't do the test. Like, come on, people. We need to do a lot of tests to track this down, and they apparently prioritized some other bureaucratic issues over getting the damn test out and getting lots of people to have it.
Well, okay, so let's just say once this is over and we're not sort of we haven't sort of suffered a complete systems collapse, but we're in a reasonable position to actually glean something or learn something from this. What do you hope we'll learn, or how should we go about learning and remembering for a longer period of time?
It's a great question.
So
at the highest level, the thing we can be most optimistic about is people will be more open to the idea of preparing against a future pandemic.
Sure.
Because like they say, people fight the last war. Whatever was the last war, they're ready to prepare to fight that again, right? So great, because even bigger pandemics are quite possible, and we should be ready for them. And in some sense, only mid-scale disasters make people convinced that a big one could happen, so they prepare for their big one. So at that level, you kind of need to wish for small-scale disasters, so at least people will prepare for mid-scale ones, and maybe hope for mid-scale ones, so they'll prepare for big ones. And so that, in some sense, will be the biggest benefit of this. It may come at the expense of a lot of lives, but at least then we will be willing to prepare.
So for just disasters in general?
No, I mean to this particular kind of, right. No, we don't usually generalize to all disasters in general. We generalize it to whatever the recent disasters were, and we were willing to prepare for those, but not for other ones.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Well, what do you hope we'll learn then?
Well, I mean, again, that's one concrete thing is, we should be prepared for a bigger pandemic. And people will be open to that one, especially a pandemic like this one. They'll be open to the idea that we should be prepared for that, for at least for a little while. The other thing, of course, I hope they learn is that, there's a space of possible policy responses, and we should think through them consistently and do experiments and analysis to pick the best ones rather than just going with the inertia of what we've ever done before. Let's just be explicit about this. I hope people are more open to that after this disaster, to walking through these possibilities.
Yeah. Okay.
And other things we will learn are, of course, people will be pointing fingers and trying to blame people. And so we will unfortunately quite likely learn wrong lessons, because somebody will successfully blame the wrong person because people want to blame that side, that person or organization. And, we've done that a lot in history. We've learned the wrong lessons from things that went wrong because people managed to successfully fool us into misblaming. So that's a big fear, being too eager to blame the people you think ought to be the ones to blame, as opposed to who's actually to blame.
I'm sick and tired of the politicization of things like this. It's just confusing, and it causes people to sort of focus most of their energy and attention on sort of sideshows and sort of misdirection.
Right. Now, the nations that are doing well, at least now, tend to all be sort of Northern Asian nations. And so some story will be told about why they got it right. And to their credit. So in some sense, we will credit something about them as something the rest of us should emulate. Maybe authoritarian government will be seen as more apt or appropriate because they were authoritarian. Maybe more of an engineering, calculation, analysis, technocracy will be seen as more legitimate because those are the ones who made them do the right thing. I'm not sure exactly how the credit will go out, but they will get credit. I mean, for whoever in this process seemed to have prevented the infection, at least for a while in their area, better, given their problems, they will gain credit, and we will want more to emulate them and celebrate them and say, let's be more like them.
In a lot of our discussions, global coordination does come up, doesn't it?
Right. Well, this is how we learn in some sense. So this is a good thing. And there's always been this problem, say, especially in the United States, where you can't say, well, look, they've been doing this in Finland and it's been working, so we ought to do this here. And people go, I don't care what happened in Finland. This is the U.S. and we should do what the U.S. should do. And people are reluctant to learn lessons from what's worked elsewhere. And so, but maybe for some of these bigger things, people will be more willing to say, you know what, U.S. really screwed up here. South Korea did better. How can we be more like South Korea?
Well, yeah, we've been talking about this for a while, and look, it's been great talking to you again. If there's any points which you haven't covered, and if not,
So, I mean, the main thing we should probably do is just switch into, hey, everybody, you're about to undergo some real pain over the next 2 months. We feel for you. We really wish we could be helping you. You know, we're doing what we can here to think in the abstract about helping this problem, but most of what's going to happen is out of our control and out of your control too. And for God's sake, just, you know, please hang on. You know, you'll be anxious, you'll be stressed, you'll be bored, you'll be frustrated with these people you've been locked up with for months that you usually would be able to get away from. We get it. You'll be tired of eating the same food over and over again, tired of not having fresh food, perhaps, tired of running out of toilet paper, so you need to use newspaper. I don't know what, but you know, it's just going to go bad over the next few months, and we get it, and we're sorry, and we feel for you.
True. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your time again, Robin. And yeah, I'm really hoping it doesn't end up as bad as some of the possible futures we've been talking about. But yeah, one can only hope.
Well, it'll be bad in some places because it already has been.
That's true.
But we can hope that there won't be as many of those places.
That's right, and we learn something from it in the end. All right. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks everybody for listening, and if you like it, please subscribe. Cheers. And there's some blog posts which I will definitely link to in the description.